Have you ever wondered about the origin of mythological creatures like dragons and griffins? Many cultures believed in the reality of such creatures and depicted them in art and stories. But where did these beliefs, these myths, find their origin? Did they come straight out of the imagination of, say, social influencers of the day? Were they derived from, say, source literature? For example, literalistic interpretations of biblical accounts of the leviathan and the behemoth from the book of Job? Or is there another explanation for the beliefs of so many in dragons and griffins? Today I want to discuss the idea that the origins of mythological creatures are grounded in a literal reality of such a creature's existence. This might seem to support somebody like Ken Ham and other young earth creationists who insist that dragon legends are the direct result of eyewitness reports from people living right alongside creatures such as dinosaurs or even possibly winged dragons. But we're going to see another literal interpretation of God's creation that leads to a very different understanding of the literal reality of mythological creatures. We have all of that and much more coming up. Imagine you're living in the ancient Near East and you stumble upon one of these skulls as you plow your field or you're exploring a local cave. What if you were taking a break from helping build a pyramid and spent some time wandering in the Egyptian desert and happened upon this large collection of bones laid out on the desert floor? Or what about this set of bones laid out on the desert floor? What would you think? Where would you think these bones came from? Surely you would think that they came from something that had recently been alive because you're familiar with dried up bodies that have left only dried femurs, vertebrae, and skulls. You might even be familiar with the skulls of cows or water buffalo or possibly lions and camels. But what you find yourself standing in front of now are so much larger than anything else you've ever seen, and they have such odd features, unlike anything you're familiar with. Despite this, depending on the shape of the bones, you undoubtedly would attempt to create in your mind an image of what that organism must have looked like when it was alive. Because, for all you know, there are relatives that are alive, they're just around the bend. What about that first skull again? What could that hole in the center be for? Other holes in skulls that you're familiar with are for eyes. So maybe this is some sort of huge eye that's at the center of the forehead of this creature. The skull is so large, it must have come from a very large organism. A huge human-like thing, possibly, with a single eye, possibly? Sounds like the mythical Cyclops. But if the Cyclops was imagined from these bones, is the Cyclops really a myth? Certainly not to those who witness the actual bones themselves and imagine them to represent a real organism. And what are those massive skeletons found lying in the Egyptian desert? In this case, the bones are absolutely real, and they must have been the remains of formerly living things. But when did that organism that gave rise to those skulls and bones live? If you lived 2,000 years ago, and you stumbled upon these bones, would you have believed that they came from an organism that had died 100,000 years earlier, 1,000,000 years earlier, 40 million years earlier? Oh, definitely not. People at that time not only had no concept of what we might call deep time, they didn't have any concept of the term extinction. It was common to believe that God or the gods, depending on one's understanding of how the deity had created the world not too long before, that these organisms in this world had been created in this present day. The idea that one of God's creatures could no longer exist anymore would have been heretical. Rather, if you lived at that time, you would look at those preserved remains and assume that they were left by an organism that had died not long ago. And therefore, that organism likely had relatives living in the area that were still alive. Maybe a friend caught a glimpse of some large creature off in the distance, or maybe heard stories about creatures from lands far away. It would not be hard to infer that the bones you just witnessed and you saw must also be the remains of those animals from those stories. So then, are the griffin, the cyclops, or the dragon simply mythological creatures drawn up only from the minds of some creative person who's telling a story? Or were they as real as the lion or the elephant or the rhino, which many people may never have seen actually eyewitnessed in their life, but been told about? And certainly those are real creatures. In the minds of most at the time, it's not surprising that these creatures would have been as real as any creature that you or I might have seen with our own eyes. The dragon exists nearby because you've seen its remains, or you've heard about somebody that's seen its remains. The cyclops exists because you've seen its head in a local collection of town heroes, the hero bones that have been kept by the city leaders. The griffin had a trunk, legs of a lion, the head of an eagle, and wings that stand and guard deposits of gold because the bones of a griffin have been observed in rocks very near to where gold sometimes is dug up in Asia. All these creatures were very real in the ancient mind that had no concept of fossilization. They had no idea of vast periods of time, and they had no concept of the extinction of organisms. Most of what I've just presented to you is the thesis of Adriana Mayor, a research scholar associated with Stanford University Department of Classics. Author of numerous research articles, she has also authored several popular books that examine the origin of myths and folklore. Her most influential book is The First Fossil Hunters, Dinosaurs, Mammoths, the Myth in Greek and Roman Times. I was reminded of Mayor's description of the literal origins of dragon myths when I recently read an article by young earth creationist and geneticist George Purdom. She works for Ken Ham at the Creationist Apologetics Ministry Answers in Genesis. Purdom's article was a response to a critical review that had been written by a graduate student who had visited the Creation Museum and had some critiques of some of the different displays there. In particular, the new dragon display that was at the Creation Museum at the time, and here's one of the billboards that was advertising that just a few years ago. Ken Ham approvingly pointed to her response in his many visible blogs many days later. The seminary student had employed Mayor's work as a reasonable alternative explanation for reports of dragons in history and provided a number of other responses why Ken Ham's vision or explanation for dragon legends and dinosaurs was neither scientific nor consistent with scriptural evidence. Purdom's response is not really much of a defense of Ken Ham's vision of dinosaurs and dragons. She is utterly dismissive of Mayor's thesis. Her response, which we'll see in a moment, is simply to borrow Ken Ham's favorite expression, "Were you there?" and then insinuate that Mayor's views of the age of the earth make her conclusions suspect. Let's look at that in her words. But Mayor's views are based on her ideas about the past. She wasn't there, and she doesn't presuppose the Bible is truth. She interprets the evidence of fossil beds and dragon legends in the light of her presupposition that man's ideas about the past, including evolution and millions of years, are true, and God's word is not. So what Purdom's doing here is she's suggesting that because Mayor doesn't have the correct biblical view, or the biblical worldview glasses that Purdom has to be able to see the truth of the nature of dinosaurs and dragons, she can't possibly actually understand the origins of these dragon myths like Georgia Purdom and Ken Ham can. I can only conclude that Purdom has not read Mayor's book, The First Fossil Hunters. The detail in that book is astounding, but more importantly, the conclusions she draws, that's Mayor draws, have nothing to do with a presumption of evolution or necessity to believe in millions of years in order to draw her conclusions. For Mayer, it would not matter if the fossils and bones were interpreted as having been laid down 4,000 years ago or 4 billion years ago. If ancient peoples looked at bones and interpreted them as representing creatures living in their time, then time and evolution is of no significance. Young Earth creationists should be able to readily accept these conclusions of Mayer. The only reason it appears that Purdom has any trouble with Mayer is that Answers in Genesis seems to have already decided the truth about dinosaurs' existence. And they're bent on promoting a dichotomous choice. Dragons were either absolutely real and lived right alongside man, or dragons never existed and are absolutely, completely mythological. Mayer has proposed a third and I think much more likely option. Dragons were conceived of as real creatures and believed to be real. They are not simply made up legends, nor did anyone who originally believed in dragons believe they lived millions of years ago. When the Bible and other cultures talk about dragon-like creatures, it speaks about them as if they were real because, by all indications, they absolutely were real to the original audience. And we could say that they were real to history since they're based on real organisms, right, that had lived in the past. But this isn't good enough for Ham and Friends. They want dragons and dinosaurs to be real in the sense that our belief in them is not derived from our inference from fossils or other remains such as footprints. Rather, they can only be real if humans actually saw the living creatures themselves, if they actually lived right alongside them. Ken Ham's Creation Museum and Christian Apologetics Ministry, Answers in Genesis, they have little use for this form of literalism. For them, a description of a behemoth in the Bible must be a dinosaur, and it can't be a description of a dinosaur known only from bones, but one that people had to have seen with their own eyes. Ken Ham would have us to believe that any mention of dragons or any image scrawled on a wall that looks like a dragon absolutely must represent an eyewitness account of a living, breathing dragon or dinosaur. Although, as we'll see, he will allow for those to be dinosaurs that have been maybe misinterpreted over time and turned into dragons. Nonetheless, only eyewitness testimony is valid for creationists. Otherwise, it's just inference from evidence, which in Ken Ham's mind is always suspect. As he always says, we believe in observation or operational science, and so-called historical science is not to be trusted. So, did dragons exist? Yes and no. I don't believe there were fire-breathing, flying dragons at any point in time, though there may have been creatures that had some of those features that are similar to dragons. However, people almost certainly encountered massive bones from extinct organisms that they understandably interpreted or as representing the remains of organisms living in their day. Yes, they really believed in dragons, griffins, believed that they were as real as any other animal that they knew. As further evidence, Mayer documents a widespread phenomenon in the Mediterranean region around the time of Christ. At that time, many villages in the Mediterranean had collections of what they called hero bones, which were mostly large mammoth or mastodon bones, tusks, that had been found in areas surrounding those towns. And then they had been preserved as remains of animals and even considered to be possibly giant humans that had lived in the recent past, like in the last 100 years. And they were thought to be the area's protectors, hence its heroes. Over time, the attributes of these heroes and stories of how they died and where they lived, they were almost certainly embellished, thus becoming far more mythic in nature. But nonetheless, the myths were actually grounded in the belief of the literal reality of their existence, and they had literal physical evidence of that existence. I should note here that Adrian Mayer has written a second book on Native American legends, Fossil Legends of the First Americans, in which he argues, I think quite persuasively, that they also encountered many bones of extinct organisms. And they also interpreted these bones as literally representing many of the organisms that become what we think of as legends, but were born out of real encounters with real organisms, albeit the remains of organisms. A search of the Answers in Genesis website reveals only one other mention of Adriana Mayer, and that is with respect to a story out of China about dinosaur tracks and some conclusions that led some to think that there were dinosaurs and human tracks that had been found together. Adriana Mayer was part of the study, and interestingly, the Answers in Genesis report tells the story of how those dinosaur tracks have been known by Chinese for thousands of years, and that ancient Chinese thought these tracks looked like lotus leaves, and had developed a number of stories to go along with those tracks. But could there also be other ways that Chinese have interpreted those particular tracks over time? If you were a Chinese peasant in the year 400 and came upon what looked like huge reptile tracks in the rocks, and you knew nothing about geology and the origins of those rocks, would you not imagine that they had been formed by some great beast that had walked that way in the not too distant past? What about pterodactyl fossils found in China that have obvious evidence of huge wings? Or even more likely, what if you found a theropod dinosaur claw? Would you not imagine what animal this claw belonged to? You can't help but wonder, like, what animal had this claw? Would you assume that this animal was extinct? Probably not. And you would probably be constantly aware of its possible presence. You'd be looking around like, where is this creature with this giant claw? Because you would feel like that thing could swoop down and scoop you up. The Chinese should have legends about dragons. It's not surprising. And it has nothing to do with their possible beliefs in an old earth or an evolutionary worldview. Those legends come from explaining something that was very real. And yet, the reality of those bones and footprints doesn't mean that dragons, as they are portrayed in the Chinese literature, are an accurate reflection of what those bones represent, or that dragons may still be alive in the inner forest of China today. We also have to consider, and I'm not dismissing other ideas of how dragon legends came about. Certainly could be a mixture of things. We know that there are Komodo dragons, right? And there are very large lizards, certainly not of the size that dragons portray, but nonetheless they have the shape of them. So if you combine, I actually see a Komodo dragon with dragon-like features other than wings, and I then see giant bones, all right, or footsteps, or things that I could imagine as being wings in rocks, right, that I imagine being organisms that were recently alive. Well, then you combine the two to turn into something like a dragon. Well, let's see how we might be able to sum this up. The belief in mythological creatures like dragons and griffins may not be entirely based on imagination or ancient eyewitness written testimony. The discovery of large and unusual fossils in ancient times could have led to the creation of legends and myths surrounding these creatures. The ancient people who found these fossils likely believed that they were creatures that were still alive, and they had relatives living in the area. Furthermore, the idea of deep time and extinction did not exist in these ancient times, so it was possible that the belief in dragons and griffins were rooted in a literal reality of their existence. Creationists may feel that dragon legends are the direct result of eyewitness reports from people living inside creatures such as dinosaurs or even winged dragons. They may want to believe that God told Job of a fire-breathing dragon because Job was an eyewitness to such a creature. But it could well be that Job and his contemporaries really all believed that such a creature exists, and that was based on real encounters with fossils. And God was, in this case, accommodating their beliefs in the literal reality of dragons to make his point about being the author of all creation. This form of what I'll call a literal interpretation of God's creation and of Job 41 presented here leads to a different understanding of the literal reality of mythological creatures than the one proposed by creationists, who insist that dragon legends are the direct result of eyewitness reports from people living right alongside dinosaurs, or possibly even something more dragon-like. Okay, I have to add a brief addendum here because Ken Ham, just a few days ago, after I had prepared this talk, commented about dragons and fossils. He doesn't mention Mayer's thesis directly, but he obviously understands and knows about it. His comments are interesting because he seems to suggest that her thesis that I have just discussed is actually plausible, all right? That it's not an illogical case that she has made. But of course, he argues that his thesis is still better. He says he has the truth because the Bible tells us directly about dinosaurs and dragons. He thinks that the reports of dragons in cultures all around the world are the result of people that are actually interacting physically with dinosaurs, eyewitness-like accounts of dinosaurs because of their interactions. And he knows this because he says the Bible tells us there were dinosaurs interacting with people 4,350 years ago, or shortly after the Noahic flood. Well, that's his inference from the scriptures anyway. And from those interactions, he is now saying that people misremember the actual features of those dinosaurs and therefore have sort of morphed them into the dragon legends we have today. So he's not really saying, in a way, he's trying to get away from saying there were actual dragons that had dragon-like features that ever existed. And so the mythological features of dragons, though, are based on a reality. The reality are dinosaurs. but not dinosaurs that have been imagined from looking at bones or remains of dinosaurs, but of actual eyewitness accounts of dinosaurs. Interestingly, he's now kind of downplaying the existence of actual dragons. And this is a trend that I've noticed at Answers in AIG, despite their dragon display, which does talk about dragon legends and their relationship to dinosaurs. But I've heard many, many speakers actually from Answers in Genesis support the idea that dragons were literally real as well, in addition to dinosaurs. They might have been dinosaurs, but they were dinosaurs with features like dragons. But there is less and less mentioning of fire-breathing dragons, despite the mention of such a beast in the book of Job. So I'm not really sure how to explain the literal leviathan of the Bible within the young earth creationist context. But it seems to me that Ken Ham's thoughts are being shaped somewhat by the ideas of Mayor, and in thinking that things like dragons are mythological in the sense that they are adaptations of real things in the world, but not literally the descriptions of what organisms actually existed. Okay, yeah, that was a mouthful. But let's just think again about, let's contrast Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis, and their obsession with explaining Job 40 and the behemoth. Right? The behemoth, as they insist that there must be a literal, wooden literalistic interpretation of that particular account. They point to the references to the behemoth's tail and to the size of the behemoth and so forth. All right, all these different features that are mentioned by God in his description to Job of this great creature that he has made. And they will say that this can't be represent hippos or represent this or be a phenomenological language of this. It has to represent an actual physical description of an actual organism. And of course they say, like, this is like a sauropod, right? This is a large dinosaur that's being described. And we know dinosaurs are real and they lived with human beings, and therefore Job would have been familiar with this dinosaur. But what I've always found curious is they take that rigid insistence on a particular literalistic view, hermeneutic, right, method of interpretation of Job 40. And you flip the page and you go to Job 41, and you rarely hear young earth creationists talk about in the same way, literally interpreting Job 41 as a physical organism that had these particular features and that people were living alongside them. And here we even have Ken Ham in this article kind of dismissing the idea of dragons as being real creatures, but rather only real in the sense that they were dinosaurs that had been misremembered and sort of embellished. Now, does he mean that God is embellishing when he describes the Leviathan to Job in this very ancient book? Let's just look at a few of the verses from Job 41. This is from the English Standard Version. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils come forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. In his neck abides strength, and terror dances before him. The folds of his flesh stick together, firmly cast on him and immovable. His heart is hard as a stone, hard as a lower millstone. Now, I find verse 24, which I don't believe I've ever heard commented on by young earth creationists, but his heart is hard as a stone. Are we to take that literally, that he has a heart that is as hard as a stone? I guess as a biologist, that's a little bit hard for me to understand an organism being described that has a heart that is as hard as stone, because I don't know how a heart works if it is as hard as a stone. And so to me, these aren't descriptions of the actual biological features of this organism, saying that, yes, his heart is like a stone, it is a stone. but nonetheless is describing, is phenomenological language describing the immensity of an amazing organism. But in this case, an organism that, as I mentioned before, a possible hypothesis that actually comes from Mayor that might be helpful in the interpretation of this text is that Job and his friends would have had a knowledge of an organism like this. That you might say is, well, that's just a myth. But what we're saying is, it's not really a myth. It's a myth in the sense that no such organism actually exists that has these exact physical features. But they believed that an organism exists that had these physical features. There was an organism that breathed fire, that there was something like this leviathan, which by all descriptions in here is very much like a dragon of sorts. And then God ends up with, on earth there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. This description is a description that could be an accommodation to Job and his friends' belief in an organism of such stature and nature. And it could also be an embellishment to describe phenomenologically characteristics of things of God's creation without actually describing an actual literal organism. Nonetheless, I'm not here to decide exactly how this is interpreted. What I'm here to say is that young earth creationists are inconsistent in their application of their own hermeneutical principles when they insist that Job 40 is a description, a literal description of a particular dinosaur that Job lived with and saw. But they seem to want to downplay the features described here. Now, I'll say that some do, some don't. I've heard young earth creation. In fact, there is a video on the Answers in Genesis website posted just in the last few days in which let's see, I think it's Brian Osborne giving a talk at Answers in Genesis, and he's talking about, he does mention a fire-breathing dragon. He mentions Job 41, and this is the extent to which they usually mention it. They just mention the whole fire-breathing thing because they understand that people are like, what's that all about? And I kid you not, he says, well, I mean, it's possible that there could have been dinosaurs, and again, he thinks it's a dinosaur that's being described. There could have been dinosaurs, or I don't even say he could have been. There were dinosaurs that were fire breathing, and that fire breathing could be like. And then he shows an example. He shows an example of a bombardier beetle, right? This little tiny beetle that squirts hot acid out of its derriere as a defensive mechanism. And he says that, look, there's a bombardier beetle, and it squirts hot acid. All right, almost like squirting like a flame. That's his analogy. That's the best he can come up with as an explanation for why there were dinosaurs that could breathe fire. All right, they had smoke coming out of their nostrils, and their breath kindles coals. That's quite a leap, to say the least. And this is why I think most young earth creationists I've found downplay this whole text in the sense of interpreting it literally. But if you're going to downplay this text and not interpret it in a particular literal sense, then you can't flip over to Job 40 and say that you have to interpret that literally, and this must be a description of a dinosaur. But there's such a temptation by young earth creationists to interpret Job 40 as a dinosaur because otherwise they don't really have a text to go to, all right, in terms of dinosaurs living with people. All they have is inference that if God created all the kinds and he preserved all the kinds on the ark, which in itself is a question about what it means that all the kinds were preserved on the ark. Does that necessarily mean that all the ones that were created were all preserved to the point of the ark and then preserved on the ark? Couldn't there have been extinction before the ark? I've never heard young earth creationists really deal with that question either. If you don't have Job 40 as a description of a dinosaur, all you have is the inference that dinosaurs must have been on the ark, and therefore at least Noah saw a dinosaur. And then after Noah's flood, yes, all the dinosaurs went extinct because they preserved dozens and dozens of, at least dozens of different kinds of dinosaurs. Maybe they went extinct quickly, but certainly people saw them. And so Ken Ham is intimating in this recent article that those possibly very old experiences of dinosaurs, because dinosaurs might have gone extinct very quickly after Noah's Ark, but nonetheless, there was this residual memory in people's minds that then became dragon legends. But of course, we don't have to have the dragon legends. We have, I mean, dragon legends are like people's misremembering, but we do have the Bible, which tells us in Job 40 about an actual dinosaur there. And there we have an absolute true and faithful message, right? Um, but he can't avoid Job 41, right? So you can't dismiss dragons as simply being misremembering dinosaurs when you also have a physical description of this thing called a leviathan. You have to deal with that too. Okay, my addendum kind of got out of control there, but about the recent stuff that Ken Ham has said about dragons and dinosaurs. Now, honestly, it's a little bit confusing because I find, just like I do with a lot of things with Answers in Genesis, there's a lot of mixed messages here. They're always seeking to respond to some particular news item and then give their own little spin on it. And they tend to try to answer a specific question and provide an answer. But often those particular answers are inconsistent with, or the logic of their answer is inconsistent with explaining something else. All right. And so that's sort of the whole point of pointing out Job 40 and Job 41 is that they apply different hermeneutics to those two things because of the inconvenient truth, right, of Job 41. Just to wrap things up really quickly, this is just a really interesting way of thinking about or putting yourself in the mind of an ancient Near East individual who, again, I have to remind you, doesn't have any concept of an ancient Earth, doesn't have any concept that things could go extinct, doesn't have any concept of organisms changing. Their assumption is anything that you saw, any bone you picked up, represented an organism that was absolutely alive at that time. And so it is completely natural for unusual things that no one had ever seen, bones that no one had ever seen. You're going to build in your mind an image of what the organism, the tissues of that organism surrounding that bone would have looked like. And that is a very reasonable explanation for the origin of various myths about organisms. After all, even today, we collect dinosaur bones and we draw images of what maybe that dinosaur would look like. Now, those are based a lot on anatomical observations of where muscles are attached to those bones and all this stuff. And I think that we have some probably relatively accurate sort of ideas of what the fleshed out organisms look like. But in many cases, we don't know what some of the appendages were. We don't know the coloration of a lot of these animals. There's all kinds of stuff that is still, I mean, that's why the look of dinosaurs has changed over the last 40 years. Any of you who have grown up reading dinosaur books, it realizes that today's dinosaur books look very different than the past. And that's not just imagination. Some of that comes from actual research that has been done that is, we're gradually discovering more and more and more. Sometimes we have found very complete dinosaur fossils in which the skin has been preserved for us that we didn't have before. We're learning how to understand the preservation of color. And so we are getting a far greater ability to have a more complete image of the literal features of dinosaurs, right? We're getting closer to that real image. But just imagine you're living in a time in which you don't have those kind of skills to be able to take a giant skull and imagine what, if you put flesh on it, what it would look like. And so you go back to that Cyclops, right? You go back to that mammoth skull. And how many people would have been familiar with elephants at the time? All right, there's not a lot of elephants in the Middle East at this particular time. And so looking at an elephant, seeing it die, seeing it defleshed, and then like, oh, this is an elephant skull. That hole in the center is where the trunk comes out, right? It's the nose. No, you wouldn't have known that. You would see that large hole, and it's pretty clear. Well, pretty clear. I think it's not unreasonable to think that people would have imagined that that's a giant eyeball socket, right? And so you're going to imagine like, wow, that thing had to have been a real organism. This thing's made out of bone, right? This is an actual skull, and it belonged to an actual real thing. and that real thing was alive at some point. At what point? Maybe 10 years ago, right? Maybe a year ago. And so that thing must be living over there on the other side of that hill. And I better be prepared, in case I run into it. Um, okay, I'm just repeating myself now. This is everything I've just talked about. But I just find it intriguing and interesting hypothesis. And if you've never heard this idea, it's an idea worth considering. It's probably not the full explanation for all different myths, right? You can take this thesis way too far. But nonetheless, I think it has some merit as having it being an important part in the development of various myths. All right, let's call it quits there. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye bye.